Through the hallways of Rosewood Hills, Jada and Janelle walked with their heads held high, knowing it wasn't a matter of if things would escalate, but when. And that moment was quickly approaching. The days blurred into each other, each one colder and more ruthless than the last, as if the walls of Rosewood Hills were closing in around them, squeezing just enough to remind them that this place was never meant for them. Every passing hour felt like another test of how much they were willing to endure. They stood tall against the stares and whispers, the cheap insults and forced laughter of students who had long learned that cruelty here was rewarded, not punished. But beneath their apparent calm, they felt the pressure building, steady and sure, like storm clouds before a downpour. It was Ryan, of course, who decided that words and insignificant shoves were no longer enough. He had always craved a larger audience, always wanted to see how far he could push before something broke. And now, sensing the cracks forming, he wasted no time in planning something cruel enough to attract all eyes at school. Something that would humiliate the twins in a way they could never ignore, no matter how strong they pretended to be. The plan wasn't complicated because it didn't need to be. Cruelty never is, not when backed by confidence and a crowd. They were composed, their faces displaying serene expressions, but beneath that facade, they felt the weight of every gaze following them, every whispered word among passing students. They were used to furtive glances, to murmurs, but this was something sharper, colder. It wasn't curiosity, they knew that well. This was the kind of attention that comes with a judgment already passed, with a line drawn before they could even utter a word. It wasn't just because they were new, or just because they were twins. It was because they were black, and that made them stand out more than anything else. Their father, Derek Rivers, had warned them it might be like this. He had never sugar-coated reality for them. He taught them to expect moments like these, to carry themselves with strength and pride no matter what they faced. He made sure they could defend themselves if ever necessary, not just with words, but with a skill and control few their age possessed. Yet, with all his lessons, with years of preparation, entering this place felt like walking straight into a storm they could see coming from afar, but from which they couldn't escape. "Look at that," said a boy's voice, loud enough for them to hear without a hint of discretion. He was leaning against a pillar near the school entrance with the arrogant smile stretched across his face as his friends laughed beside him. "Twins?" added another boy with disdain, as if the word itself were an insult. But what they discovered next left them speechless. When Jada and Janelle Rivers transferred to a prestigious private school, almost exclusively white, they knew it wouldn't be easy, but they never imagined what awaited them. From the moment they crossed those polished gates, Ryan Mallory and his gang of bullies set out to break them. The twins endured every insult, every shove, and every slur thrown their way. But when the harassment turned physical, they had no choice. What the bullies didn't know was that Jada and Janelle were black belts, trained by a father who taught them never to bow their heads to hatred. The aggressors thought they were attacking easy prey, but they couldn't have been more wrong. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. The sun stretched over the grounds of Rosewood Hills Academy, casting a warm but relentless light on the manicured gardens and tall brick buildings that seemed like silent guardians of the students gathering in small groups. Everything in that place spoke of money and ancient traditions, from the perfectly trimmed hedges to the stone pathways. The air felt heavy, as if the school had been built not only to educate, but to remind everyone who walked its halls exactly where they stood in the world. Jada and Janelle Rivers, moving side by side, felt that reminder like a weight on their shoulders, even before reaching the entrance steps. Their uniforms were impeccable, their demeanor. Hateful words, dripping with venom, sprawled across the metal in thick strokes of red paint. The insults were bold, shameless, left there in plain sight. Black markers had been used to draw caricatured and grotesque faces, with exaggerated features meant to mock them, twisted and dehumanizing images. Crumpled papers had been pushed through the locker grates, all filled with more insults, each worse than the last, as if the bullies took turns to see who could write something more vile. As they stood there, with stiff shoulders and tense faces in an attempt to maintain composure, the hallway around them erupted in laughter, sharp and cruel. Students stopped to point, to take photos with their phones and spread the moment like a wildfire. Some openly laughed, loudly and unrestrained, while others covered their mouths, pretending to hide their amusement. But it didn't matter. The twins saw it all, felt every taunt like a needle under the skin. Ryan leaning against a nearby locker, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a smile spreading wide across his face, his eyes shining with a bitter victory. Zach and Brent flanked him, both looking pleased with themselves, their arrogant satisfaction evident in every angle of their posture. "We thought you could use some decorations," Ryan called out, loud enough for the whole hallway to hear, his voice dripping with false concern. "We thought it would make you feel more at home." The crowd roared with laughter, the sound advancing down the hallway like a wave crashing against the shore, relentless and thunderous. And for a brief moment, the air was filled with unbearable tension. The message in his gaze was as clear as day. Janelle, steady as a rock, felt the same fire burning in her chest, her pulse quickening as she breathed in slowly, steadying herself against the rising tide of fury. They wouldn't give him the reaction he wanted, at least not yet. But they both knew they couldn't pretend this would be overlooked. Something had changed in that moment, something sharp and irreversible. This wasn't just another insult to brush off, it wasn't something they could sweep under the rug like whispers in the hallway or taunts from across the classroom. This was a line crossed, a challenge thrown at their feet in front of the whole school. As they cleaned out their lockers later, wiping away the paint with paper towels, Janelle and her friends exchanged knowing glances, a silent vow passing between them. This was far from over. The rough keys handed to them by the janitor, who avoided making eye contact and remained silent, Jada's voice broke the silence between them. Low and steady, it carried a weight that had been building up for too long. "No more," she said, her tone soft but as firm as a stone wall. Janelle didn't need to ask what she meant. She felt the same burning inside her, the same final crack running through the patience they had worked so hard to maintain. She nodded once, decisively and with certainty. "No more," she agreed. The decision wasn't made out of anger alone. It came from a deeper place, from the understanding that surviving wasn't always enough. There were moments when staying still meant giving away parts of yourself that you could never reclaim. That moment was approaching, they could feel it as clearly as the air they breathed. It was impossible not to notice how he moved as if he owned the place, with a carefree air that stemmed from knowing that rules never applied to him. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, as if he had stepped out of a magazine, and he wore the uniform as if it were a costume. Tie loose and shirt unbuttoned, showing how little he cared. "Hey," Ryan exclaimed one morning as the twins crossed the courtyard to their lockers. His voice was powerful, confident, designed to grab attention. His friends gathered around him, already laughing, as if they didn't even need to hear the joke. To know that it would be good. "Did you get lost on the way to the service entrance?" he asked, his words clear and sharp in the open air. His friends burst into laughter, too loud for such a weak insult, but they weren't laughing at the joke itself, but at its target. Janelle kept her gaze ahead, her face serene, her steps steady. She didn't give them the satisfaction of looking back. Jada's gaze briefly met Ryan's, sharp and firm, but she didn't linger either. She saw the mocking smile on his face, saw his friends nudging each other, feeding off the attention. And although her chest tightened with anger, she remained calm. They both did. But Ryan wasn't done. "I guess they don't understand English," he shouted louder, making sure everyone present could hear. "Maybe we should try speaking their language. How about talking about the jungle?" The laughter that followed was worse this time. It spread across the courtyard like an unstoppable wave. The crowd gathered, drawing in even those students who had previously paid no attention. Now everyone was watching, expectant, some amused, others intrigued, but none interested enough to intervene. Jada's jaw tensed, her teeth clenched, but she took a deep breath, calming herself. She felt Janelle close by, her presence a strong anchor keeping her from being swept away by the storm Ryan was trying to unleash. As the days passed, the situation only worsened. Ryan's friends, Zach and Brent, intensified their harassment. They turned bumping into the twins in the hallways into a game, throwing their books to the ground with fake apologies and smug looks that made it clear they knew exactly what they were doing. "I didn't know janitors could take classes now," Zach muttered one afternoon as they passed by, loud enough for nearby students to hear. "Maybe they're just here to practice," Brent added with a malicious smile. "The school has to keep the floors clean somehow." The twins said nothing. They picked up their books, straightened their backs, and carried on. But with each shove, each insult, the pressure increased a little more, like a weight slowly crushing them, testing how long they could endure before it destroyed them. What made it even harder was the silence of others. No teacher intervened, no student spoke up. Even those who weren't involved simply looked away, pretending not to see. The teachers kept their eyes on their papers or screens, reluctant to get involved, allowing the injustice to grow. Like a thunderstorm looming beyond the horizon, they wouldn't be the first to strike. Their father had taught them better than that. But if the storm was approaching, they wouldn't run. And when it arrived, they would be ready to face something much more powerful than they expected. The first days at Rosewood Hills passed. They saw it just as Jada and Janelle had anticipated, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. From the moment they set foot in their first class, it was clear that every gaze was waiting for them, not with welcome or curiosity, but with cold and silent judgment. The classroom itself was neat and bright, with sunlight streaming over the pristine desks and gleaming on the polished floors. However, no amount of light could hide the way the students and even the teachers treated them as if they didn't belong there. The teachers would say their names without looking up, in monotone voices, their attention already shifting elsewhere, as if the twins were nothing more than a line on the attendance list. In the hallways, the crowd seemed to move just enough to block their way, forcing them to step aside or move more slowly, while pretending it was an accident. But it wasn't. They knew it, and the students around them knew it too. However, Jada and Janelle didn't give them the reaction they wanted. They held their heads high, moved with determination, and didn't let the tension corner them. Even when the stares grew longer and the whispers sharper, they moved forward every day, strong and silent. It wasn't long before Ryan Mallory made his appearance. He wasn't a. Have you ever felt like you were being watched, as if every gaze was a judgment? Quiet? As they crossed the main doors of the building, tall and heavy, Jada and Janelle felt the soft mechanical sound that seemed too calm for what awaited them on the other side. The cold air conditioning hit their skin, but it couldn't extinguish the burning inside them. The students, already gathered in the hallway, turned to watch them, conversations pausing as eyes followed the twins down the corridor. Some faces showed curiosity, others, evident hostility, and a few revealed something worse, amusement. As if they were waiting for the moment when the new girls stepped out of line and gave them something to laugh about. Jada's gaze traveled down the hallway, reading it like a map of territories marked by invisible boundaries. She observed how the bullies clustered near the lockers, how the girls whispered behind their impeccable nails, casting sidelong glances full of silent malice. Every detail was etched into her mind, every glance a challenge waiting to be answered. They knew this was just the beginning. The looks, the whispers, the sharp words spoken loud enough to hurt, but low enough to deny if confronted. All of that was just the start of something that would grow and grow until it became impossible to ignore. But they were ready. They had faced worse situations than this. They had prepared for storms like this. Even though about the academy. In Rosewood Hills, the sky seemed clear and serene. Jada and Janelle could feel the pressure building up in the air. The promise of what was to come kept them steady. Have you ever felt like something dark is lurking in a place that seems perfect? At home, their father noticed it, even though they tried to hide it. Derek Rivers had taught them to fight, to defend themselves with skill and control. But he had also taught them to anticipate problems, to pick up on the silent signals that announce bigger storms. During dinner, he watched his daughters closely, reading the tension in their jaws and the weariness in their gazes. He didn't ask them directly, didn't pressure them to speak before they were ready. But when they finally did, he listened without interrupting. "Remember what I taught you," Derek said that night, his voice calm but firm as steel. "Control is power. They want to destabilize you, don't let them." Jada nodded, her mouth set in a determined line. Janelle shared the same resolve, though her eyes reflected a spark of frustration that was becoming harder to conceal. "They are pressuring us," Jada said, consistently but seriously. "More each day," Derek replied without hesitation. "They think you'll give in, they want you to. And if they don't stop?" Janelle asked, her voice just as firm, the meaning clear. Derek's eyes met theirs, and in that gaze there was no hesitation, no shadow of doubt. Then they will discover that you are not the ones who break." Her words floated in the air like a silent promise, one that the twins carried with them the next day and the days that followed, letting it rest just beneath the surface of their serene expressions. They walked. Have you ever felt like you're on a stage where you don't belong? Jada noticed how their adversaries puffed up their chests, as if they owned the place. A spark of anger ignited within her, but she quickly extinguished it. Her father's calm and firm voice echoed in her mind. They want a reaction, don't give it to them. Janelle's grip on her backpack strap tightened, her knuckles contrasting with the dark material. However, like her sister, she maintained her unchanging demeanor. The bond between them was stronger than words, and Janelle knew that Jada felt the same smoldering fire, waiting for the right moment. They didn't need to speak to understand each other. They had faced enough challenges together to move and think as one. They advanced without hesitation, their gaze fixed on the doors ahead, ignoring the burning stares that seared their backs like sunbeams amplified by a magnifying glass. The further they ventured into the courtyard, the clearer the message became. This place was not designed for them. The gleaming floors, the imposing windows, the shiny display cases, and the proud banners hanging from the walls. The stage was set, but they were never meant to be part of the performance. Yet they kept walking. Ignore them, Janelle whispered, her voice low but steady, more a reminder than advice. She didn't look at her sister as she spoke, trusting Jada to understand without further explanation. I see them, Jada replied, her tone quiet but filled with determination. But what they saw next left them breathless. Have you ever felt like the whole world becomes a stage, but not in the way you'd wish? The teachers passing by hesitated in the empty hallway, their gazes pausing for just a moment before quickly looking away, pretending not to see, pretending it wasn't their concern. Janelle's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she struggled to control her breathing, her chest filled with a rage she could barely contain. She could feel her sister beside her, Jada's barely contained fury burning hot by sheer force of will. They had endured the taunts, they had endured the shoves, but this was different. It was public, deliberate, a performance designed to strip them of their dignity in front of the whole school. No matter how hard they tried to stand tall, the weight of humiliation was more crushing than anything they had faced before. Their father's words echoed in their minds, firm and clear, urging them to maintain control. They, letting discipline guide them. But as the laughter continued and Ryan moved forward with a slow, mocking applause, both felt how that line became blurrier, that fragile line between patience and action. You should be grateful, Ryan taunted, approaching, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the noise. It takes a lot of effort to make you two feel like you belong here. The crowd clung to his words, their gazes shifting between him and the twins, waiting, eager for a reaction, for the slightest crack in their armor. Jada's eyes locked with Ryan's, her gaze steady and unwavering, and although she didn't utter a single word, what happened next was. The next time Ryan and his group advanced, they wouldn't back down. They were determined to fight with the ferocity instilled in them from the start. The atmosphere in Rosewood Hills hadn't eased after the cruel joke, on the contrary, it had become thicker, like an invisible yet palpable presence. Tension hung in the air like a taut thread over the courtyard, as students gathered in their usual spots, speaking in hushed tones and casting furtive glances toward the paths they knew the twins would tread. Jada and Janelle, as always, moved forward together, feeling every gaze upon them, every whisper hanging in the air like smoke too dense to ignore. Still, they held their heads high, walking with firm steps, eyes forward, fully aware of what awaited them beyond the next corner. Ryan Mallory was already there, leaning against the sun-warmed stone wall, his expression a mix of boredom and cruelty, as if this moment wasn't a choice, but something already written. Zach and Brent by his sides, relaxed posture but sharp eyes, waiting for their chance like wolves on the prowl. There they are, Ryan declared, loud enough to catch the attention of all nearby students. His voice echoed in the courtyard like a rocket launched into the sky, drawing a wider audience of onlookers who didn't even bother to hide their curiosity. But what would happen next would leave them breathless. The muffled sound of Ryan echoed as he collapsed to the ground, clutching his ribs. You've had every chance to back down, Jada declared firmly, not just to Ryan, but to every onlooker present. Her voice carried the weight of everything she and her sister had endured up to that moment. But you insisted on moving forward. She released his wrist, letting him fall completely to the pavement, his body folding as he struggled to breathe, his face a mix of pain and disbelief. Janelle stood beside her sister, her chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. The two of them, side by side once again, like a. When they entered this school, the ground beneath their feet felt different, as if they had conquered it with sheer determination. The crowd, once eager for the spectacle, now remained in uneasy silence, realizing that this was not an ordinary fight, not a simple exchange of blows between school rivals. It was something deeper, something final, a storm that had been brewing for too long and finally unleashed. Maybe now they'll learn, Janelle said, her voice cutting through the dense, charged air, that we are not the ones to be pushed around. Driven by stubborn pride, Brent tried to get up once more, but Janelle arrived before he could fully do so, planting her foot firmly on his chest and pressing him back to the ground with undeniable authority. He growled in frustration, trapped. However, what happened next left everyone speechless. Under the weight of his own arrogance and her unyielding strength, "Stay down," she warned him, not as a threat, but as a truth as solid as the ground they stood on. Jada's eyes scanned the courtyard, meeting the gaze of every student brave enough to hold hers. Her expression was firm and relentless. She didn't need to speak the words aloud because they were clearly written on her face. This ends here and now. However, as the twins stood victorious over the bullies who had tormented them, the tension in the air was far from dissipating. Sitting for weeks, they knew this was not the true end of the battle. They could feel it in the way the crowd shifted uncomfortably, in the absence of the teachers who had not yet arrived, in the murmurs that were already beginning to rise, filled with distorted versions of what had happened. They knew there would be repercussions, that victory had its own price, but they did not regret their choice, not for a moment. Because, for the first time since they set foot on this campus, they made it clear to all who watched that they should not be underestimated, that they should not be mocked without facing the consequences. The twins stood tall, their breathing steady, their eyes fixed as they watched the defeated boys writhing on the ground. The fight may have ended for now, but the storm was just beginning. The outcome of the fight did not unfold in the chaos one might have anticipated, but in a strange prolonged silence that seemed to stretch every moment, accentuating the weight of what had happened. But what would happen next would surpass all imagination. What would you do if I told you that what seemed like a simple school confrontation turned into total chaos? Before Jada or Janelle could respond, Ryan coughed in pain, forcing himself to speak through clenched teeth. "We were attacked," he gasped, his voice filled with desperation and fear, but also with that familiar arrogance of someone who believes they can still manipulate the narrative if they are the first to speak. "We didn't do anything, they just went crazy." The crowd stirred, their silence beginning to crack under the weight of falsehood. Some students looked away, reluctant to meet the gaze of the twins or the gathering adults, while others watched Ryan with uncertainty, torn between following his lead or finally acknowledging what they had witnessed with their own eyes. Jada's jaw tensed, but she kept her composure, her father's voice echoing in her mind. "Control is power. Speak only when it truly matters." She held Carpenter's gaze directly, her clear and sharp eyes, and stated with a firm and calm tone, "They've been harassing us since we arrived today. They crossed the line, we defended ourselves, nothing more." Carpenter's expression faltered, a moment of discomfort crossing his face before he hid it behind the rigid professionalism that Rosewood Hills demanded from its staff. "We'll handle this inside," he said, though there was no real promise in his words, no guarantee of justice. "All of you, come with me." The twins didn't protest. They exchanged a silent look that spoke more than words ever could. Janelle added, her tone sharp as steel, as she watched Brent writhing on the ground before her, her eyes fixed on him. She took a measured step forward, making it clear she wouldn't allow him to get up so easily. Zach, desperate to change the. Heading towards her, he grabbed a piece of broken wood from the ground, something that had come loose from one of the benches, clutching it with both hands as he lunged towards Janelle recklessly. But she saw it coming as if everything was happening in slow motion, her senses heightened by adrenaline and discipline. Her body was already moving to intercept. She slid to the side with fluid precision, her hand reaching out to catch his wrist in a firm and unyielding grip, twisting sharply to disarm him and make the makeshift weapon fall harmlessly to the ground. In the same motion, she spun, hitting her elbow on the side of his face and sending him to his knees, dazed and defeated. "Low blows won't save you now," she said, her words low but clear, resonating among the circle of students watching, who had fallen into an expectant silence, their initial amusement replaced by something more akin to astonishment and fear. Ryan, furious and embarrassed, lunged again towards Jada, his fist striking in a disorderly and desperate manner, driven by panic rather than skill. But Jada was already one step ahead, dodging his attack and catching his wrist in a firm grip, twisting it sharply as she closed in on him and drove her knee into his stomach with ruthless force. His breath exploded from his lungs. But what happened next left everyone speechless. The air was thick with mockery. And now what? Are you going to run to Daddy and cry? The line had been crossed, crystal clear, bold and undeniable. Jada's eyes bore into Ryan's, her voice calm but filled with the fire that had been burning under her ribs for too long. No, she said, her breathing steady, her words strong enough for everyone to hear. We stop running. Without hesitation, she moved with a fluid and controlled motion, planting her palm against Ryan's chest with a sharp and rehearsed force that made him stagger, his eyes wide with surprise as the air escaped from his body. Beside her, Janelle moved with equal skill, crouching and sweeping Brent's legs with precision, sending him to the ground with a dull thud that instantly silenced his laughter. The courtyard erupted in a clamor, students shouting, stepping back to form a wide circle around the fight, their faces torn between amazement and excitement as the twins took complete control of the moment. Ryan recovered quickly, but his typical smug smile vanished, replaced by pure frustration as he lunged at Jada, striking clumsily. But she saw it coming from afar, dodging his blow and driving her fist into his stomach with tense and controlled force. Brent tried to jump up, but Janelle was already there, grabbing his shoulder and... Have you ever found yourself in a situation like this? Have you ever been in a situation where looks speak louder than words? That's exactly what happened today. Jada, with a sharp and unwavering gaze, instantly spotted him. She didn't stop walking or flinch at his words, but her eyes pinned him in place, cold and steady. If that's what you were expecting, she replied smoothly, her tone so clear that everyone could hear, then you're even more pathetic than I imagined. A low murmur, a wave of surprise, ran through the students as they caught the sharp edge of her words. Ryan's smile faltered at the corners, for a moment it broke enough to reveal a spark of annoyance. You've got a lot of nerve, Ryan retorted, straightening up from the wall and taking a step forward, closing the distance with the casual confidence of someone who never thought they'd be challenged. You speak as if you belong here. Janelle shifted her stance, squaring her shoulders firmly, her voice solid but laden with the weight of every insult swallowed, every cruel joke endured in silence until that moment. We do belong here, she affirmed, her eyes fixed on Ryan without a hint of doubt. More than you ever will. You strut around here like you own the place, but deep down you know the truth. Without your little clique. You're just another coward hiding behind cheap jokes and weak friends. Her words cut deeper than she expected, piercing through the superficial armor Ryan wore like a mask. The crowd responded with a louder murmur, anticipating. And then came what would come next. The tension in the air was palpable, like a heavy cloud pressing down on every witness of what had transpired. The bullies lay on the pavement, groaning, clutching their bruised ribs, and licking the wounds of their wounded pride. The crowd that had cheered on their cruelty before now stood still, their thirst for spectacle replaced by a cautious, almost guilty silence. No teacher had intervened during the fight, no adult had stopped what was unfolding in plain sight. But now, as if summoned by the lingering dense atmosphere, they began to arrive at the scene with tense expressions of confusion and concern. Though deep down, none could feign genuine surprise. They had all seen this coming, or at least had felt the inevitable rupture of something hidden beneath the polished facade of the school. And now that it had happened, they could no longer pretend ignorance. Enough, echoed Mr. Carpenter's sharp voice, the vice principal, as he made his way through the circle of students. His eyes scanned the scene with a mix of indignation and relief for having arrived only after the violence had ceased. His gaze shifted from the injured boys scattered across the yard to the twins, who stood tall in the center of it all, breathing steadily, their posture strong, their faces undisturbed, making it clear they were the undisputed victors. What's going on here? Carpenter demanded, although the question hung in the air more as a formality than a true search for answers. But what he would discover later would change everything. Jada and Janelle moved like an unleashed hurricane, their bodies working in perfect synchrony. Every strike and counterattack landed with precision, shaped not by uncontrolled anger, but by years of hard and patient training. Ryan, forced to retreat by Jada's rapid and punishing blows, tried to regroup, but fear seeped into his eyes, now clear and unmistakable under the flush of his skin and the beads of sweat starting to form on his forehead. He had always believed himself untouchable, protected by his numbers and his status, but none of that shielded him now. Stripped of his usual advantage of mocking superiority, he found himself face to face with someone who would not cower or yield. "You thought we would just accept it," said Jada, her breathing controlled, her voice steady, even as she dodged another wild blow and responded with a sharp elbow to Ryan's ribs, making him grunt and stagger to the side. "You thought you could keep pushing until we broke." Her words cut as deep as her blows, and Ryan, still gasping for air, found himself not only fighting against her fists, but against the truth in her voice, strong enough for everyone present to hear and feel it to their bones. Brent, on the other hand, stood watching from the sidelines, his expression unreadable as he observed the unfolding confrontation. Having risen hastily, he charged at Janelle with a frustrated growl, but she faced him head-on, sliding under his blow and driving her palm into his sternum with enough force to send him crashing backwards, his body folding in on itself as he hit the ground hard, gasping for air that refused to come. "You picked the wrong fight. Have you ever felt like the world pauses just before a storm hits?" That's how the air vibrated as Jada and Janelle decided they weren't going to back down. Janelle brought her opponent down to the pavement with precise movements, each step of her response carved by years of training flowing through her muscles like an innate reflex. Zach lunged at her with wild desperation, but Janelle gracefully dodged, catching his arm as he passed and throwing him forcefully alongside his friend, leaving them both tangled and panting. Ryan, clutching his side, tried to return to Jada with a growl, but she met him with a clean blow under the chin, making his head snap back and forcing him to stagger as his balance betrayed him. The twins didn't hesitate, didn't falter, didn't question the decision they had made. Their father's teachings, ingrained in them during long hours of practice, guided every move, every block, every counterattack. They weren't there to entertain anyone, or to prove anything to those watching. They were there for that a line had been crossed, and they were ready to act. The courtyard had become their arena, and as the conflict intensified, it became evident to everyone that Jada and Janelle were not the victims in this story. They were the retribution. The day had started with the lazy morning murmur and carefree steps, but now the place throbbed with an energy so sharp and alive that it seemed like every brick under their feet vibrated with it. The circle of students had widened, their voices rising in a mix of awe and excitement as Jada. The students exchanged glances, feeling how the moment shifted, as if the ground beneath that confrontation began to tremble. Ryan's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed as he closed the distance even more, so close now that Jada could perceive the flicker of uncertainty behind his gaze, although he quickly masked it with anger. "Say it again," he challenged, his voice tense and fragile, like a glass about to shatter. "You heard it the first time," Jada replied calmly, her gaze unwavering. "You just can't handle the truth when it's thrown in your face." Ryan's chest rose sharply as he struggled to maintain his arrogance, but the cracks were evident to anyone who looked. He shifted his gaze to the crowd, feeding off their attention, needing it to rebuild his confidence. "Do you think you're brave? That you can stop? Is there a place where we can speak without consequences?" "We don't believe so," Janelle said, her tone sharp enough to cut through the noise around them. "We know." That was the final push Ryan needed to abandon words altogether. His hand shot out without warning, hitting Jada's shoulder with force, causing her to step back from the sudden impact, though she quickly regained her footing, her feet firmly planted as if she were taking root right there. The audience's astonishment rang loud and clear, students holding their breath as the scene before them shifted from tension to open threat. Seizing the moment, Brent approached Janelle, knocking her books from her arms with a cruel smile, sending pages flying in all directions. But what happened next left everyone speechless. Have you ever felt a tension so palpable it could be cut with a knife? That was the moment they exchanged a look loaded with unspoken understanding and followed Carpenter, who led the small group away from the courtyard. They left behind the scattered crowd of students, whose excitement had turned into unease. Inside the administrative offices, the walls seemed to close in, the air felt colder, but none of that dimmed the fire burning beneath the twins' calm exterior. sitting side by side in the stiff chairs outside the principal's office, their hands poised to continue the conversation that had been interrupted by the sudden turn of events. Their hands rested calmly on their knees, their eyes fixed ahead. Meanwhile, Ryan, Zach, and Brent exaggerated their injuries to anyone willing to listen, presenting themselves as victims in a story they had distorted beyond recognition. It wasn't long before their father arrived. His steps were measured, his face serene, although beneath that calmness hid a storm as intense as the one that had led his daughters to defend themselves. Derek Rivers entered the office with the unbreakable confidence of a man who had faced much worse adversities and was prepared for any eventuality. His eyes first went to his daughters, assessing them not only for possible injuries but also for the strength of their spirits. When their gazes met, strong and unbroken, a glimmer of pride passed between them. Then he turned to the principal, a man named Harrington, whose suit was as impeccable as his expression was tense, as if he had been forced to step away from something much more relevant than the well-being of his students. "We will conduct a thorough investigation," Harrington stated sharply, his hands meticulously crossed. But what would happen next would change the course of everything. "This is not over," Sandra hissed, her eyes sharpening as she defiantly locked gazes with Derek. He responded calmly, his voice low and steady. "No, it's not." The weight of his words filled the air, not as a threat, but as a promise of what was to come. Not a hasty threat, but as an unbreakable promise. The twins rose from their seats, their suspension papers handed to them with cold efficiency. They held their heads high, their posture strong, their gazes clear. The fight in the courtyard had ended, but a new battle was beginning, one that wouldn't be resolved with just fists. Leaving the office with their father walking between them, they understood with absolute clarity that they would face whatever came together. The house remained silent under the evening sky, the soft hum of distant traffic and the whisper of leaves in the breeze offering a calm that seemed too peaceful, as if the storm that had started in the halls of Rosewood Hills had followed them home, waiting for the right moment to unleash itself. Inside, the air was heavier than usual, not from fear or regret, but from the understanding that what had happened at school was not the end of their troubles. They knew the Mallorys wouldn't let it all go. Derek sat at the kitchen table, his posture relaxed, but with his eyes fixed on the open window facing the quiet street, he seemed to anticipate what was coming, long before it arrived. His daughters sat across from him, the three of them gathered not in silence, but in shared preparation. Their bond was stronger than blood, reinforced by all they had endured and fought for. "You knew that they would come here," Jada said, her voice firm, not asking a question, but stating a fact that everyone understood without the need for words. Her father nodded slightly, his eyes still scanning the street, his mind already mapping out the steps ahead. "People like them," Derek replied, his tone calm, his words measured. "They don't accept defeat quietly. They convince themselves they have the right to win, regardless of the truth. And when they lose, they bring the fight to your doorstep, thinking they'll catch you off guard." Janelle's gaze shifted to the window, her hands resting on the table, her fingers loose but ready, her mind evaluating her father's words with the same precision she applied to every move she had made in the yard. "They think we're done because we walked away," she said, her tone low but sharp, "but they've never understood what true strength looks like." Before Derek could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel echoed in the air, clear and sharp like a warning bell. They heard the car doors slam shut, heavy and furious, followed by the unmistakable sound of expensive shoes hitting the pavement. An echo of anger and entitlement approached their door with each step. "They're here," Jada whispered, though the words were unnecessary. There was no doubt. Derek rose from his chair with a fluid motion, filling the room not with tension, but with a solid and unyielding certainty. He told his daughters to stay behind him, not because he feared what was coming, but because he wanted them to see how a battle was fought when he crossed the threshold of his home. He wanted to show them that strength is not always measured in blows, but in how you hold your ground when the world tries to knock you down. Before the doorbell rang, before the knocks were heard, Derek opened the door himself, stepping out onto the porch with the calm authority of a man who had faced much larger storms than the one in front of him. Sandra Mallory's face was contorted in a mask of fury, barely held together by the thin thread of social courtesy. Her eyes burned beneath perfectly styled hair and expensive sunglasses perched on her head like a crown of false superiority. Greg Mallory stood beside her, his sturdy figure rigid with barely contained anger, his jaw clenched as he flexed his fists at his sides, the veins in his neck standing out like taut strings pushed to their limit. "Do you think you can get away with this?" Sandra spat, not bothering to offer a greeting, her words sharp and quick as she approached Derek, her heels resounding loudly against the concrete. What happened next was more unexpected than anyone could have anticipated. In front of him, on the gleaming desk, lay the decision that would change everything. "However, for now, I'm afraid both of your daughters will be suspended until we can review the facts." Derek's voice, when he spoke, was calm but carried the weight of a mountain. "My daughters defended themselves, that's clear, and I expected nothing less from this place." Harrington's eyes narrowed at the silent accusation in Derek's words, but he said nothing to deny it, offering only a slight nod with tight lips. Ryan's parents arrived shortly after, and the atmosphere in the room immediately became tense. Sandra Mallory burst into the office as if she owned it, her sharp heels echoing against the floor, her eyes burning with anger, hidden behind a thin veil of rehearsed concern. Her husband Greg followed closely behind, his sturdy figure rigid with anger, his jaw clenched as he shot a fierce look towards Derek and the twins. "This is unacceptable," Sandra snapped before anyone could speak. "Our son has been assaulted. And you're telling me that these girls, these violent girls, will simply be suspended? They should be expelled, arrested." Her voice rose with each word, and although Harrington tried to calm her with vague promises of further actions, it was evident that Sandra Mallory would not be satisfied until the twins were mercilessly punished. Derek's gaze did not waver from her, his eyes firm and inscrutable, but his daughters could feel the tension in him, not wild or uncontrolled, but the same controlled force that had taught them to bear. He watched as his fury burned like dry wood, feeding itself. But what happened next was even more striking. He never raised his voice, but every word he spoke settled like a rock falling into calm water, spreading until it was inescapable. "You brought violence to my door, and now you will live with the consequences." Greg, still panting on the porch floor, managed to rise onto one elbow. His eyes, widened with disbelief, looked at Derek, seeing not only the man in front of him, but everything he had underestimated, everything he had not understood until this moment stripped him of his false power. The sirens, distant but growing closer, began to echo through the neighborhood, their sound cutting through the thick air like a blade. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the noise and chaos, their faces etched with a mix of curiosity and silent satisfaction, as if they too had grown tired of the Mallory's arrogance and now watched with silent approval as justice unfolded on the River family's porch. Derek did not move, unfazed by the sound of the sirens. He stood tall, unperturbed, with his daughters by his side, their clear and proud gazes witnessing the scene. Whatever the police brought with them, they were ready, because they had already won the battle that truly mattered. This fight was never just about them. It wasn't about the punches thrown or the bruises left behind, but about standing strong when others expected them to fall. It was about showing the Mallorys, the school, and the whole city that their strength could not be taken away or broken. Greg's anger turned into a fierce roar as he threw an uncontrolled and heavy punch towards Derek. His face was flushed with fury, his eyes bulging with the blind certainty that strength would prevail where words had failed. But Derek was already moving, turning his body with practiced ease, his hand rising to catch Greg's wrist in mid-flight. The power of the blow was completely nullified by Derek's firm grip. Greg's eyes widened in surprise as Derek twisted his arm enough to unbalance him, guiding him to stagger to one side before releasing him without wasting an ounce of energy. "You've made your decision," Derek said firmly, his eyes as hard as iron. "Now you will live with the consequences." But Greg, too enraged and stubborn to reason, charged again, this time with both hands raised in a clumsy attempt to bring down Derek, as if brute force could overcome years of discipline and skill. Sandra, shouting something unintelligible, tried to follow him, her hands clawing at Derek's arm, her fury a storm of wild and uncontrollable rage. Derek moved with impeccable precision, stepping back just enough to draw them in, using their own momentum against them. He caught Greg's arm again, unbalancing him and sending him crashing to the porch floor with a thunderous impact that shook the wooden planks. Sandra threw a desperate punch, but Derek caught her wrist with the same skill, twisting her arm behind her back with careful and practiced control that left her trapped, her breath hissing through clenched teeth. "You came to my home," Derek said, his voice resonating with the authority of a contained storm. Greg's legs lunged forward once more, driven by an anger that clouded his judgment. His movements were clumsy, revealing that he had never truly learned to fight, only to impose his will with brute force, presuming that no one would dare to challenge him. But Derek had encountered men like him too many times to be surprised. With ease, he dodged Greg's attack, pivoting gracefully and using his opponent's momentum to slam him against the porch railing, which creaked under the impact. "Do you think this is over?" Greg barked as he staggered back, trying to catch his breath and spitting out words through clenched teeth, as if they could still have any effect now that his fists had failed. "You're finished, you and your girls, all of you." Derek's response was calm, devoid of fury, because he didn't need any, just the clear and undeniable truth. "Truth? No," he said, advancing towards Greg with the calm authority of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. "You are." Greg threw another punch, wild and desperate, but Derek caught his arm once more, holding it tightly before twisting and slamming him down onto the porch floor, leaving him sprawled on his back. The air escaped him in a choked gasp, leaving him gasping under Derek's shadow. Sandra screamed, her panic now undisguised, as she tried to free herself, scratching Derek's arm with trembling hands. Her movements were erratic, filled with the fear that had finally emerged upon seeing her husband in that situation. What would she do now, with everything crumbling around her? Have you ever felt the tension of a scene where silence is more deafening than any scream? Derek released Sandra's wrist, not because she had forced him to, but because it was no longer necessary. Her strength had vanished in the blink of an eye. She staggered back, her chest rising and falling with frantic breaths. The twins were right at the entrance, their eyes fixed on the drama unfolding before them, faces carved in silent concentration, not fear. They watched their father confront the Mallorys, not with uncontrolled aggression, but with meticulous precision. Every move was a lesson they had seen in theory, but now it came to life. A living example of D. He dedicated his life to teaching them discipline. "This is what they always do," Derek proclaimed, his voice firm and resonant, loud enough for both the Mallorys and their daughters to hear. As he stepped over Greg's pained body, he continued, "They think they can barge into our space, into our lives, and break us with threats and violence. But they forget that we do not break. We stand firm." Sandra's eyes quickly darted to her struggling husband, gasping for breath, and then back to Derek. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, to spit out another threat or excuse, but the words didn't come. Her breath caught in her chest, her fury devoured by the weight of her own helplessness. "Call the police," she finally shrieked, her voice breaking under the pressure of her panic. "Call them, he attacked us." But even as she screamed, there was a hollowness in her words, a shaky weakness that made it clear she no longer believed in her own cries. "You came here," Derek retorted. No matter how hard they pushed, when the flashing lights turned the corner and the first patrol car pulled up at the entrance, Derek's voice broke the heavy silence one last time, resonating across the porch, cutting through the garden, and embedding itself in the memory of all who bore witness. "You came looking for a fight," he said with unwavering tone, his presence as solid as the ground beneath his feet. "Now, you found her." The blue and red lights bathed the front of the house, pulsing against the walls and windows in slow, steady waves, as if the storm that had thundered at their door had not ended, but only changed shape, exchanging fists and fury for the cold authority of uniforms and badges. Derek stood motionless in the center of it all, with his daughters on either side, the three framed by the doorway like an unbreakable line of defense against the chaos that had tried to penetrate their home. The first officers emerged from their vehicles with rehearsed caution, hands close to their belts, their eyes scanning the scene as they read the details in a silent calculation. The two bodies on the porch, disheveled and breathless, the man standing before them, calm and unruffled. Neighbors crowded at the edges of their yards, watching with tense expressions, some crossing their arms, others whispering to each other under the fading echo of the sirens. Sandra Mallory's voice cut through the tension first, sharp and frantic, raising her volume as she ran towards the epicenter of the conflict. But what happened next left everyone speechless. "Do you think you can touch our son and not face the consequences?" Derek's expression remained impassive, his gaze steady and determined, facing her fury with the serenity of a mountain challenging the wind. "Your son attacked my daughters," he replied, with a low but powerful voice, filling the space completely between them. "They stood their ground, that's the truth, whether you accept it or not. Don't you dare play the victim here," Greg snapped, his voice rough and almost trembling with anger as he took a half-step forward, his posture aggressive, his fists clenching and unclenching, eager for an excuse to strike. "Your girls are beasts, just like you, and you have the nerve to act as if you're innocent." The words hung in the air like a noxious odor, enveloping the moment in a cold silence. But Derek didn't take the bait. He let the insult linger between them, revealing more about the man in front of him than any argument could have. Then he responded, not with fury, but with absolute clarity. "You've already decided who we are," Derek said, his tone as hard as stone, "but that doesn't change the facts. You raised a bully and today he found out what happens when bullies cross the wrong line." Sandra's face contorted even more with anger, opening her mouth to spit out another insult, but before she could speak, her husband left her behind, consumed by his own rage, unable to hold back any longer. "Do you think you can speak to us with disdain in our own town? You thought you would bring terror to this house, but here, fear has no place." With those words, the truth settled in the air, undeniable and absolute. For a moment, a frozen stillness reigned on the porch, a moment. So tenso que parecía a punto de romperse con el más leve ros. Los Mallories, atrapados entre la furia y el pavor. Derek sujetaba a Sandra con firmeza mientras Greg, Torpmont, intentaba incorporarse desde las tablas de madera bajo él, su orgullo más herido que su cuerpo, pero con la mirada encargada de una ira ciega que le impedía ver la futilidad de su situación. Su rostro estaba enrojecido, las venas destacándose en sus sienes, la mandíbula apretada mientras intentaba tragarse la humiliación y convertirla de nuevo en agresión, aunque cualquiera que observara podía ver que su bravada se desvanecía bajo el peso de la realidad. Su última, sisió Sandra, retorciéndose contra el firme agarre de Derek. Su voz afilada por el pánico que intentaba disfrazar de ira, pero que se quebraba bajo la superficie, la tensión filtrándose a pesar de sus esfuerzos por mantener la compostura. ¿Sabes quiénes somos? Los ojos de Derek, firmes y fríos, no parpadearon ni una vez mientras sostenía su muñeca. No con la fuerza suficiente para lastimarla. Pero sí para dejar claro quien controlaba ese instante. Sé exactamente quiénes son, respondió, su voz calmada y baja, su mirada tan afilada como una hoja afilada tras años de silenciosa batalla. Y no me impresiona, sus brazos agitándose como si pudiera atraerlos completamente a su favor con pura desesperación. Oficial, arrestelo, exigió, apuntando un dedo acusador hacia Derek. Su rostro encendido de ira y algo más profundo, un miedo palpitante que apenas lograba ocultar. Raw and poorly disguised anger seethed beneath his fury. He attacked us, we were defending ourselves, and he assaulted us in our own community. His words stumbled over each other in an increasingly frenzied barrage with each accusation. But the commanding officer, a man whose badge read Clenny, did not react with immediate acceptance. He raised a steady hand, his eyes scanning not only Sandra, but the entire scene, reading it with the calm experience of someone who has seen enough life disasters to know that truth is rarely found on the surface. "Ma'am," said Officer Clenny, maintaining his measured and professional tone. "I need you to step back a bit and take a deep breath. We will sort this out, but I need to hear from everyone, and I will start by speaking with the owner." Sandra opened her mouth to protest, but something in Clenny's firm gaze made her abruptly stop. She let out a sharp breath, her chest rising and falling as she retreated alongside Greg, who continued to groan on the porch floor, clutching his ribs with one arm, as if the pain in his body could somehow lend more truth to his words when his turn to speak came. Officer Clenny then approached Derek, his eyes cautious but not hostile, his tone neutral. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" Derek held the officer's gaze directly, his posture The patience of a family that had faced much more intense storms than this was palpable. And they understood that the only way to move forward was to stand firm, letting the truth emerge slowly and unstoppable like the tide against the rocks. Officer Clenny moved between desks and filing cabinets with the precision of someone who recognizes a lie as soon as they hear it, someone who had witnessed too many scenes similar to the one unfolding now to confuse noise with truth. He worked methodically, gathering statements, reviewing the testimonies of neighbors who had already begun to write their accounts, and checking the recordings of nearby doorbell cameras, offered without hesitation by residents eager for justice to be finally served. Derek watched him in silence, his eyes following every movement, not with distrust, but with a cautious respect for the man's diligence. He did not see in Clenny the hasty judgment of someone looking to close a case quickly, but the slow and steady patience of someone who knew that the true answers did not come from those who shouted the loudest, but from those who remained on solid ground the longest. Jada and Janelle sat near their father, with upright posture and serene faces, although inside both felt the slow swirl of everything they had endured, of everything they had carried, emerging to the surface as the walls of the police station seemed to close in and the long wait stretched even further. However, even in the midst of the silent tension, they did not falter. They stood there. They had faced worse storms and had come out unscathed, and they knew they would overcome this one too. Clenny finally approached, his notebook hidden under one arm and his expression marked by the weight of what he had gathered. He stopped in front of them, clearing his throat gently before speaking. "Mr. Rivers," he began, with a careful but firm voice. "I have reviewed the statements from the neighbors and the security footage, and it is evident that you did not initiate the confrontation. It is also clear that your actions were in self-defense." Derek nodded slightly, acknowledging the officer's words without boasting, without relief, but with the calm firmness of a man who did not expect anything less from the truth. Clenny continued, shifting slightly as he glanced at his notes. "Furthermore, the footage we have collected shows that the Mallorys approached your property aggressively. They first crossed onto your porch, raised their voices, and initiated physical contact. Multiple angles confirm this." A soft breath escaped between Jada and Janelle, not exactly a sigh, but the slow release of contained tension, a moment of quiet reaffirmation that settled in their chests like a small flame that refused to be extinguished, no matter how much the wind had battered it. However, Clenny continued, his tone still balanced despite the seriousness of the injuries and the Mallorys' claims, "We will have to document everything in detail. There will be statements, formalities aside, a full report, and there may still be legal proceedings. But I want you to know," he added, fixing his gaze on Derek with something that almost seemed like respect. "From what I've seen, the evidence is clear. Have you ever wondered what happens when truth and lies collide head-on?" That's how Derek's story began, his voice firm and calm as he explained, "They came to my home uninvited." He didn't rush his words, allowing each one to settle with weight and clarity. "They were furious about an incident at school involving our children. They confronted me on my porch, shouted threats, and then," Derek gestured slightly towards Greg, "it was him who threw the first punch. I defended myself and my family." "And your daughters?" Clenny asked, his eyes shifting towards Jada and Janelle, who remained silent but steadfast by their father's side. "They witnessed everything," Derek replied without hesitation, his tone resolute. "They didn't intervene, they stayed inside, just as I instructed." Clenny nodded slightly, his thoughtful gaze weighing Derek's words against the scene unfolding before him. Then he turned to Sandra and Greg, with his notebook in hand, ready to hear their version. Although his restrained and tense expression hinted that he was already beginning to unravel the truth. Sandra launched into her version of events with the same desperate, halting delivery she had shown before, weaving lies with practiced ease, referring to herself and her husband as victims of an unprovoked attack. Her words oozed arrogance, portraying Derek as the aggressor. But her performance crumbled under the steady gaze of Officer Clenny, who made no move to interrupt, but whose eyes darkened with silent skepticism the more she spoke. "And you claim you were defending yourselves?" Clenny asked once she finished, his tone heavy with doubt. Derek's response came without hesitation, his voice low and steady as he promised, "We'll give you all the answers you need." As they followed Clenny to the interview room, Jada and Janelle felt the weight of the moment settling deeper within them, not as a burden, but as a reminder of all they had overcome to get to this point. They sat beside their father, answering questions with precision, recounting the events of the day with firm voices that carried the complete truth of their experience, leaving no room for doubt or distortion. Piece by piece, the story unfolded under the officer's watchful eyes, not as a tale twisted by fear and prejudice, but as a chain of clear and unbreakable facts leading from the first shove in the yard to the final confrontation at their door. They spoke of days of harassment, of the cruel joke that had pushed them to the brink of a fight imposed by boys who believed they could do anything without consequences. Sequences. They didn't speak as victims, but as survivors, and as their story filled the room, the shape of truth became impossible to deny. Later, as they left the interview room for a quieter corner of the police station, Derek turned to his daughters, his voice soft but laden with the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "See how it works," he said, not as a lesson, but as a reminder of what they already knew inside. "They'll try to twist the story, make it their own, but truth is patient, it waits, and when the time comes, it stands tall." Jada met his gaze. Her eyes sparkled with determination. "We're not done yet," she said firmly. Janelle nodded beside her, her expression just as resolute. "But we're close," she added. Clenny stepped forward again, a slight clench in her jaw as she opened her notebook once more. "There's something else," she said with a cautious yet confident tone. One of their neighbors mentioned previous issues at the school. "We're going to review the security footage from the location. If there's a pattern, it'll help us solve this faster." Upon hearing those words, a silent understanding was shared between Derek and his daughters. So far, they had borne the weight of the bullying alone, endured in silence as the school turned a blind eye. But if the truth of those days could finally come to light, this battle would not only clear their names, but also expose the rot that he had grown up in Rosewood Hills for too long. "Do it," Derek said without hesitation. "Let the whole story come to light." Clenny nodded slightly and stepped aside to make the call. His movements were efficient, his purpose clear. As the silence of the station enveloped them once again, the twins and their father sat together, firm and unyielding. They knew the storm had not completely passed, but they also knew the tide had irreversibly turned in their favor. And no matter what came next, they would be prepared. The soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the station with a constant murmur, a sound that could have been insignificant at any other time. Under the weight of what was happening, each second seemed to stretch as the final pieces of truth began to fall into place. Derek sat with his daughters by his side, forming a solid line of determination in a room that had become thick with tension. The air was heavy with the scent of papers, ink, and the slow but unstoppable advance of justice that was finally beginning to ignite. Across the room, through the narrow glass panels of the adjoining office, they could see Sandra and Greg Mallory sitting at a separate table, their posture crumbling under the mounting pressure. Sandra's features, once held up by the confidence that privilege bestows, began to crack. Her eyes fluttered as she realized the gravity of the situation they were in. From one officer to another, his mouth tight in a thin line, as if trying to contain the fear pulsating just beneath the surface. Greg, on the other hand, sank deeper into his chair. His slumped shoulders spoke of something more than just physical pain. His gaze avoided the window, avoided Derek's eyes, avoided the inevitable. Officer Clenny returned to the room with a bulging folder of printed photographs and reports under his arm, his expression sharpened by the clarity that only irrefutable evidence can provide. He moved with a determination that filled the space between them, pulling up a chair to the table before placing the folder and opening it. The first page captured the harsh light from the ceiling, a still image taken from a neighborhood. But what he saw next left him speechless. The store's security cameras captured Greg Mallory in full motion, his face contorted in fury, his fist flying towards Derek's head. Without a word, Klein spread the images on the table, each one more incriminating than the last, revealing the escalation of violence frame by frame. The truth was laid bare in a sequence of moments too clear to deny. There was no confusion in the photographs, no room to distort stories or fabricate excuses. Only the undeniable fact that the Mallorys had brought their anger to Derek's doorstep, igniting the confrontation with their own hands. Derek's gaze remained steady on the images. Images, her serene face, her slow and steady breathing, not because the evidence surprised her, but because it confirmed what she had always known. That the truth, though belated, had never strayed from her side. We've also obtained the first recordings from the school's surveillance system, Klein continued, his voice steady as he presented another set of images, darker and grainier, but equally clear in their narrative. The camera captured the prank in the lockers, the boys cornering your daughters in the hallway, the shove that triggered the fight in the yard. Among these, the statements from your neighbors' witnesses and the confessions of some students after our investigation. We are building a strong case in your favor. At his words, a silent sigh passed between Jada and Janelle, not as a relief of weakness, but as a slow and patient exhalation, as if they were finally allowing themselves. But what happened next changed everything. Feel for a moment how the weight of the battle begins to lighten from their shoulders. And the Mallorys? Derek asked, his voice low but firm, carrying the question not with desperation, but with the gravity of responsibility, like a man who never needed to shout to be heard. Klein's lips tightened for a brief moment before responding, choosing his words carefully, but leaving no room for doubt. They are in trouble, he replied with a tone imbued with calm inevitability. They came here with arrogance, believing that their story would stand on its own, but with this evidence, their accusations quickly crumble. The more they speak, the deeper they dig their own grave. As Klein spoke, a movement caught Derek's attention beyond the glass. Another officer entered the room where Sandra and Greg were seated, with a thick stack of papers in hand, dropping them on the table with a thud that seemed to resonate in the air between them. Sandra's mouth moved, her words lost behind the glass, but her growing panic was evident, her gestures abrupt and frantic as she tried to argue against the mounting pile of facts. Greg, despite his earlier anger, now remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him, his hands tightly clasped as if he could contain the consequences through sheer willpower. Let them see it all, Derek murmured, more to himself than anyone else, though Klein heard him clearly and nodded in a small show of agreement. Let's see what happens when they push too far. That's what we intend, Klein replied, and what happened next exceeded all expectations. He closed the folder with a deliberate movement, as if sealing the Mallory's fate between its pages. Let them see what happens when they cross the line, said Klein, closing the folder with a gesture that seemed to encapsulate the fate of the Mallorys. Mallorys among its leaves. Moments later, another officer joined them. He was younger, with a freshly pressed uniform, but his expression already hardened by the harsh realities of the job. In his hands, he held a printed transcript that he placed before Clenny with a slight nod. Statements from two of the students, the officer explained, with a firm voice. They confirm the previous harassment at the school, consistent with what Mr. Rivers and his daughters reported. Clenny quickly scanned the pages, his eyes narrowing with each line he read. That should be enough, he finally said, placing the papers on the table with a silent weight that seemed to settle not only on the table, but in the air around them. We will proceed with the charges: assault, trespassing, possibly harassment, once the full extent at the school is established. Derek showed no reaction, his calm remained intact. But Jada and Janelle sensed the subtle shift in their father's posture, the silent satisfaction of a man who had held his ground not only for victory, but for justice itself. Sandra's voice, sharp even behind the glass, rose once more, a desperate sound lacking the confidence from before. Greg's shoulders slumped even further, his head lowered as if he could no longer bear the weight. The accusations against you and your daughters will be dropped immediately, the evidence leaves no room for any other decision. Jada and Janelle shared a look, a silent moment of mutual understanding. It wasn't a surprise, for they had always known that their truth would prevail. It was a silent vindication, the kind that doesn't shout in triumph, but settles deeply in the chest, firm and secure. Derek tilted his head slightly, his unwavering composure, although behind his serene exterior there was a slight shift, a release of the tension he had carried for his daughters, for his family. Every moment of this battle weighed on him more than he would ever let show. And the Mallorys? Derek asked, not because he needed the answer, but because it was important for the words to be spoken clearly, for everyone to hear them. Klein's gaze hardened as he responded. They will face charges, he confirmed, breaking down each accusation with calm precision, as if placing stones on a scale: assault, harassment, trespassing, and obstruction. Their actions at school and here, in your home, are well documented. They won't talk their way out of this. As if to underscore the statement, another officer entered the detention area, unlocking the door with a sharp turn of the key and gesturing for Sandra and Greg to stand up. Sandra's protests, sharp and full of panic, faded under the office's firm orders, her words reduced to a murmur under the full weight of the law now bearing down on her. The truth enveloped him overwhelmingly. Officer Clenny turned to Derek and his daughters with an expression that almost denoted respect. "They've handled it well," he commented simply. "This won't be easy and it's not over yet, but they did the right thing." Derek nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement more than gratitude, because he had never fought for approval, only for what was just. As the officers proceeded to process the Mallorys, leading them out of the interview room with firm and unwavering steps, the River family remained seated, their gazes steady, their hearts united in silent unity. The tide had not only turned, it was beginning to sweep away the lies, revealing the underlying truth. And though the battle had not yet reached its final conclusion, they could see the end on the horizon, as sure and steady as the dawn. And when that moment arrived, they would face it together. The station held its breath under the weight of all that had come to light, as if the very walls, the air itself, had become heavy with the truth finally forced to the surface, too real and solid to be denied or altered by the hands of those who once believed themselves untouchable. Derek, seated between his daughters, remained still, his gaze fixed as he watched the officers do their work. Their movements were no longer hurried or unsure, but deliberate, shaped by the clarity of the evidence they had built, brick by brick, an indestructible wall around the world. Luring the Mallorys. On his notebook, and as the last neighbor finished speaking, he closed the pad with a soft snap that echoed louder than the sirens moments before. "We'll continue this at the station," he stated, his tone not allowing for objections. "But based on what I've heard so far, it seems we have more questions for you too." His eyes settled on Sandra and Greg, their faces pale and tense under the intense glare of the police lights. The officers approached to help Greg stand up, handcuffing him gently yet firmly, while Sandra's protests rose again, now weaker, her voice fading in helplessness under the overwhelming weight of reality. Derek remained motionless as they were taken away, his daughters by his side, breathing slow and steady, his gaze fixed not on the Mallorys, but on the horizon beyond them, where justice was finally beginning to find its place. Although the night was far from over, although there would still be questions to answer and shadows to clear, there was no doubt about the change that had begun. The tide was turning, and this time it was in their favor. The station had the cold stillness of a place that had seen too many lives trapped within its walls, too many voices raised in panic or protest, too many truths distorted under the weight of assumptions. However, when Derek and his daughters sat on the simple metal chairs, the waiting room, there was no fear in them, no trembling in their hands or in their breath, just the calm rhythm of, "You have no right," she exclaimed, her voice breaking under the tension, but the officer escorting her offered no response, only the silent firmness of a mission accomplished without prejudice. Greg, exhausted from fighting, stood up slowly, his shoulders slumped as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. His gaze briefly met Derek's before turning away, unable to hold the eyes of the man he had underestimated so deeply. The twins watched in silence, without boasting, without cheering, but with a deep and silent satisfaction that stemmed from the knowledge that they had weathered the storm and refused to break. They faced hatred not with fear, but with courage. They faced violence not with surrender, but with a strength forged in years of discipline and in the unbreakable bond they shared with their father and each other. As the Mallorys were led out of the room, their departure laden with a definitive heaviness, Officer Clenny turned to the family with a softer voice. "You have done well," he said, pausing as if weighing his words before adding, "You have held your ground with honor. That matters more than you realize." Derek did not respond, he didn't need to. His steady gaze followed the Mallorys until they disappeared through the exit, consumed by the system. They thought it would protect them, but instead it had revealed their true nature to the world. The station began to calm down after that, the frenetic energy of the day cooling into a more serene pace as the officers drafted reports and completed necessary procedures. But what they discovered next left them speechless. The tension in the air was palpable, laden with the weight of uncertainty. What really happened in that place? "We came here to talk," Sandra insisted, her voice rising once more, but now the cracks were evident. Her facade was crumbling as she tried to maintain her version of events. "He attacked us," she exclaimed, as Klein's eyes narrowed slightly. As if sensing that words alone would not suffice to unravel the truth, he turned to the growing crowd of neighbors gathered at the edges of their gardens, some with their phones in hand, others murmuring discreetly among themselves. "I need witness statements," Klein declared, his voice resonating with calm authority across the lawn. "Anyone who saw what happened, step forward." There was a long moment of silence, heavy and uncertain, and then, slowly, as if propelled by a shared sense of justice that had waited too long to act, a neighbor stepped forward from across the street. He was an older man, with a face lined with wrinkles and sharp eyes that did not falter. They didn't miss a single detail. He cleared his throat and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "I saw everything," he asserted, his voice firm. "They came here shouting from the moment they got out of the car. The man threw the first punch. The homeowner didn't move until they forced him to." Another neighbor joined in, then another, their voices intertwining to form a clearer picture, a chorus of truth cutting through Sandra's lies like a ray of sunlight through the fog. Each account confirmed what Derek had already said, his words firm, his memories vivid. Klein listened to every word, his pen moving steadily. But what he was about to uncover would change everything. Have you ever felt trapped in a hopeless situation? In the small room separated by a thin glass, Sandra moved like a caged animal, her hands clenched in tight fists at her sides. Her eyes, wide with desperation, searched frantically for any crack in the wall, any loose end that could unravel the case closing in inexorably around her. But there was nothing else to grasp, no lie that hadn't already tangled itself into impossible knots. Greg, once a strong and confident voice, now slumped in his chair. His elbows rested heavily on his knees, his head bowed under the weight of failure, his eyes dull and lost, fixed on the ground as if the answers he longed for could appear there. If only he looked hard enough. But all he found was the hollow echo of his own decisions staring back at him. Officer Clenny stood at the center of it all, his posture strong, his expression sharp with the certainty of the moment. He flipped through the final pages of statements and recordings gathered in the hours since the Mallorys had been taken in. His mind went over the whole story laid out before him. Neighbors' testimonies, clear and consistent, camera footage from multiple angles painting an undeniable picture, student witnesses filling in every gap that might have been left. He turned to Derek, his voice heavy with the weight of all they had endured to reach this point. "We have completed our preliminary findings," Clenny began, his tone firm and unwavering. But what he would reveal next would change everything. The news spread faster than anyone could have anticipated, driven not by rumors, but by the undeniable facts that emerged after the Mallorys' arrest and the compelling evidence presented to all. The students who used to laugh with Ryan and his friends now gathered in cautious groups, their voices lower, their gazes more careful as they looked towards the entrance, where the twins were expected to return. The teachers who had ignored the bullying, choosing silence over intervention, now carried a stiffness in their movements, a silent shame etched on their faces. Monsters as they prepared for the inevitable reckoning. Inside the administrative office, Director Harrington stood, his shoulders tense under the weight of everything that had fallen upon his institution. He held in his hands the official reports delivered by the police department, documents that left no room for doubt or delay. His gaze slid over the names listed under the clear and damning accusations. Ryan Mallory, Zach Carver, Brent Larson, and alongside them, the unavoidable final recommendation. Expulsion, effective immediately. Facing him, Derek Rivers remained calm and composed, his posture as steadfast as it had been at the station, his eyes unyielding as they met the director's, radiating a silent authority. By his side, Jada and Janelle sat with elegance, their uniforms impeccable, their faces marked by the strength of those who had weathered the storm and emerged not only standing, but indomitable. But what the board decided that morning would change everything. Have you ever felt the power of justice transforming every corner of your life? Clenny assured Derek that the official exoneration documents would arrive in less than an hour and that the school would also be informed of the findings. However, Derek already knew that this battle was one he would gladly face to the end. Jada and Janelle, though exhausted from long hours of questioning and waiting, remained firm. Firm and resolute, their sharp gazes, shoulders squared as they prepared to leave the station behind. They knew perfectly well that, although this chapter was closing, the lessons etched in their souls would never fade. As the three stood together, their silhouettes framed against the dim light filtering through the station windows, There was a silent strength in their unity, an unspoken promise that, no matter what came, they would face it not as victims in someone else's story, but as authors of their own. They had fought, they had endured, and in the end, they had triumphed. The morning sun spread over the front of Rosewood Hills Academy, casting long rays of light over the familiar paths and polished brick buildings. But today, the light seemed sharper, clearer, as if the very air had been purified after a long and bitter storm. The courtyard, once the stage for silent glances and cruel whispers, now held a different kind of weight, not heavy with threat, but filled with the silent murmur of change. The kind of change that moves through a place, not with loud shouts, but with the nervous, expectant energy of those who know that the ground beneath their feet has shifted. But what they discovered next left them speechless. Harrington began, his voice laden with the tension of a man forced to confront his own failures. In the light of the discoveries, after weeks of investigation and overwhelming evidence of harassment and assault against their daughters, the suspension has been immediately revoked. They will return to their classes today. He paused, clearing his throat as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers gripping the edge of the papers. Furthermore, the students responsible for the harassment and attack have been permanently expelled. A silence settled in, not out of necessity, but because it was fitting to let the words hang in the air, allowing them to fully settle before continuing. Derek's voice, as he spoke, carried no triumph or boastful satisfaction, only the deep and unwavering calm of a father who had fought for justice and now saw it served. It is the decision that should have been made from the start, he stated simply, not as an accusation, but as an undeniable truth. Harrington's lips tightened, a flash of something indecipherable passing through his eyes. Whether regret or shame, or both, was impossible to discern, but he nodded, the gesture small yet revealing. "We have failed your family," he admitted, his voice now lower, roughened by the weight of truth. "We have failed in our duty to protect all our students. That will change." Jada's gaze held the director's with the same clarity and firmness that had carried her through every cruel word, every push, every attempt to make her. "Have you ever felt like words have the power to change everything? Make sure it happens," she said, her voice measured but firm, making it clear that there was no room for empty promises. "Not just for us," Janelle added, her gaze sharp and unyielding, "but for every student who doesn't fit into your mold." For a moment, Harrington seemed to waver under the weight of her words, but then he nodded slightly, the papers trembling in his hands before he set them aside. As they rose from their seats, Derek gently placed a hand on his daughter's shoulders, a silent gesture of pride that needed no words to convey its meaning. Together, they walked out of the office into the main hallway, their footsteps echoing in the marble corridor that once felt like a battlefield, but now seemed like a path cleared by their courage and determination. The students watched them, some with open curiosity, others with silent respect, and a few with lingering shame on their faces as they remembered the roles they had played, whether through action or silence. But no one dared to speak, no one dared to mock or jeer. The weight of what had happened left them with no hiding place, no comfortable shadows to conceal themselves in. The twins walked side by side, their heads held high, their shoulders straight, not as victims returning, but as victors of their own story, as proof that resilience in the face of cruelty can shatter even the strongest walls. Outside the building, the morning breeze caressed their faces. In the school's foundations, a silent yet indestructible change had taken place, one that would endure long after the memory of the Mallorys faded away. Their father's words were not distant echoes, but living truths that they held close to their hearts. "Stand your ground," he had told them time and time again, and they did, not just for themselves, but for every student who walked those halls and would walk them in the future. As the afternoon sun slid towards the horizon, casting long shadows over the grass, the twins sat side by side, their laughter flowing naturally and uninhibited, their eyes shining with the pure joy of a day well spent. They had not just survived Rosewood Hills Academy, they had conquered it. And as they gazed upon the grounds of the place that once tried to silence them, they only saw the open horizon of the life they had forged with their own hands, their own courage, and their unbreakable bond. They had triumphed and would continue to do so every day. Did this story captivate you? Share it with your friends and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. In the meantime, I personally selected 2 stories that I think you'll love. Have a magnificent day. The air brushed their faces, fresh and pure, as if acknowledging the change that had finally arrived. Their fathers. They came together, their presence as strong as ever, and together they crossed the courtyard. Not in a hurry, but with the deliberate and confident pace of those who have earned every step forward. As they moved, Derek's voice, low and steady, broke the silence between them. "The storm has ended," he said, not as a wish, but as a fact as certain and unbreakable as the sun rising on the horizon. "No," Jada replied, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, her tone laden with the quiet strength that had sustained her in the fire. "We ended it." Janelle's lips curved into the smallest and fiercest of smiles, her eyes shining in the morning light. "And we will end it again," she added, "whenever it returns." Together they crossed the threshold of the school, leaving behind the shadows of doubt and stepping fully into the light of justice, finally realized. And although the road ahead would always have challenges, they knew with absolute certainty that any future storm they would face as they had faced this one. Together, unbroken, and unafraid. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so natural that it almost seemed as if the storm had never touched them, as if the winds of cruelty that once blew so strongly at their backs had quieted down to become a distant memory. However, Jada and Janelle never forgot. They did not carry the weight of what had happened as a burden, but as something much sharper and stronger. A reminder of their own strength. Strength intertwined with every step they took along the familiar paths of Rosewood Hills Academy. The school itself seemed transformed in subtle ways, as if it had learned to breathe differently. The air was no longer heavy with the tacit permission of cruelty. The teachers, once reserved and quick to look away, now greeted the twins with a respect that felt deserved, not forced. They pronounced their names in class, not with indifference, but with genuine appreciation, their voices steady, their eyes meeting theirs without the old hesitation. Their classmates had also left behind the shadows they once wore so easily. The hallways no longer echoed with mocking laughter or cutting whispers. Instead, there were nods of recognition, small but sincere, and moments of silence that felt like respect rather than avoidance. In the courtyard, where they once walked under the weight of 1,000 critical gazes, Jada and Janelle now moved freely, their heads held high, their steps unhurried. They sat beneath the old oak tree during lunch, the sunlight caressing their faces as they talked about everything and nothing at once, their voices light with the tranquility of those who no longer had to watch every word, every glance, every breath. It wasn't perfection, because they had never sought it. What they had now was something infinitely better. A peace built not on fear, but on a strength forged in fire. They believed that the battle they had fought had not only set them free, but had also changed something permanently at the school. But what they discovered next left them speechless.